You were told there is one true God, and everything else is false. But here's the quiet question most people never say out loud. If false gods are so obviously false, why did so many people believe in them with complete certainty? Not just once, not just in one place, but everywhere. And here's the deeper tension. The same humans who rejected false gods also created them. So what does that mean? Were they foolish, or were they revealing something uncomfortable about how belief actually works? Because when you look closely at every false god in the Bible, you don't just see religion. You see human psychology exposed. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start at the beginning, the pattern nobody talks about. The Bible lists many false gods. At first glance, they seem scattered, almost chaotic, like a collection of human mistakes across time. But when you slow down and really look, something strange begins to appear. They don't feel random anymore. There is a pattern underneath them, quiet but consistent, almost like a blueprint of the human mind. People did not wake up one morning and decide to invent a god just for entertainment. That idea sounds modern, almost sarcastic. Back then, belief was not a hobby, it was survival. Every false god that appears in the Bible answered a very specific fear, a very real problem that people did not know how to solve. Think about storms for a moment. You are living thousands of years ago, no forecast, no warning, just a dark sky and the sound of thunder getting closer. Your crops, your food, your future, all depend on what happens next. Of course, you create a god of storms. Not because you are foolish, but because you need a sense of control over something that feels completely uncontrollable. The same goes for death. It is confusing, final, and deeply unsettling. So you create a god of the underworld, something that gives structure to what feels like chaos. Fear of uncertainty leads to rituals. Fear of suffering leads to protection gods. It all begins to connect. And here is the part most people miss. These gods were not random errors. They were solutions. Imperfect, yes, but solutions shaped by human emotion, human limitation, and human fear. Makes sense, right? Because humans do not create gods out of stupidity. They create them out of need, out of pressure, out of that quiet voice that says, there must be something controlling this. And here is the uncomfortable part. That need never disappeared. It did not vanish when those gods faded away. It is still here, just wearing different clothes, speaking a different language, hiding in places we rarely question. But that is where this starts to get interesting. Baal, the god of control. One of the most famous false gods in the Bible is Baal. He was known as a storm god and a fertility god, but those labels only scratch the surface. In practical terms, Baal was the god of survival. Rain meant crops, crops meant food, food meant life. It was that simple and that serious. So when people worshipped Baal, it was not some careless mistake or blind tradition passed down without thought. It was a response to pressure, real pressure. If the rain did not come, families starved. Entire communities collapsed. When your survival depends on forces you cannot predict or control, your mind looks for a way to influence them. That is where Baal comes in. People believed that if they performed the right rituals, said the right words, made the right sacrifices, they could somehow affect the outcome. Not perfectly, but enough to feel less helpless. Enough to believe they had some kind of grip on the future. And here is where it gets interesting. This was not just about belief, it was about control. Or, at least the feeling of control, which for the human mind can be just as powerful. Now pause for a second and be honest with yourself. Is that instinct really gone? We do not pray to storm gods anymore, but we check forecasts constantly. We plan months ahead. We buy insurance for things that might never happen. We try to predict, manage, and reduce every possible risk. Different tools, same instinct. Back then, it was offerings and rituals. Today, it is spreadsheets, savings accounts, and backup plans. And if you have ever checked the weather 3 times before leaving the house, you are not that far removed from the mindset. The need for control never left. It simply adapted. It became more socially acceptable, more logical on the surface, but underneath, It is driven by the same feeling. That quiet discomfort of not knowing what will happen next. And Baal, in a strange way, was just an early answer to that discomfort. Asherah, the need for comfort. Then there is Asherah. She was not a god of storms or war. She was something quieter, a mother figure, associated with nurturing, protection, and presence. Not power over nature, but closeness to human emotion. Because life is not just about survival, it is also about how it feels to survive. You can have food, shelter, even safety, and still feel anxious, alone, or unseen. That is a different kind of problem, and it requires a different kind of answer. People did not just want a God who could control the rain. They wanted a God who could understand them, someone softer, someone who felt near, not distant. A presence that did not just demand obedience, but offered comfort. And this is where things start to reveal something deeper. Even within strict belief systems, where rules are clear and structure is strong, people often move toward what feels emotionally satisfying. Not necessarily what is the most consistent or the most logical, but what meets them where they are. That is not weakness. It is not rebellion. It is human nature. We are not built to live on logic alone. We look for warmth, for reassurance, for something that makes the weight of life easier to carry. And if a belief provides that, it becomes powerful very quickly. This is why figures like Asherah kept appearing, even when they were rejected or condemned. The need did not disappear just because the system said it should. It stayed, quietly pulling people back towards something that felt more personal, more human. And here is the part most people do not notice. We do not just believe what is true. We believe what feels right, what reduces tension, what gives us a sense of being held together when everything else feels uncertain. Sometimes truth and comfort align, but sometimes they do not. And when they do not, the human mind often makes a choice that feels small in the moment, but shapes belief in a very real way. Molech, when fear goes too far. Then there is one of the darkest figures in the Bible, Molech, often linked with extreme forms of sacrifice. His name alone carries a weight that makes people uncomfortable. Most hear about this and react instantly. That is insane. That is beyond understanding. But slow down for a moment, because that reaction misses something important. People at that time did not see it as madness. They saw it as necessity. The world they lived in was unstable and often brutal. War could arrive without warning. Famine could wipe out entire communities. Survival was never guaranteed. When everything feels like it is on the edge, the mind starts searching for anything that might increase the chances of staying alive. So they made a trade. Not a casual one, not a symbolic gesture, but something deeply serious. They believed that giving up something incredibly valuable could secure protection, that it could influence forces beyond their control. It sounds disturbing, and it is, but it is also revealing in a way people do not like to admit, because it shows how far humans are willing to go when fear takes over. When the stakes feel high enough, the line between rational and irrational starts to blur. The focus shifts from what makes sense to what might work, even if the cost is extreme. Now, here is where it becomes uncomfortable again. This pattern did not disappear. It simply changed form. Today, people do not perform ritual sacrifices like that, but they still give things up in the name of safety and security. Time gets traded for money. Health gets traded for stability. Relationships get pushed aside for the promise of a more controlled future. It looks more reasonable on the surface, more acceptable, but the core idea is not that different. Something valuable is still being offered in exchange for a sense of protection. And the strange part is, most people never question it. Because fear, when it is strong enough, has a way of making almost anything feel justified. The golden calf, the need for something visible. One of the strangest moments in the Bible centers around the golden calf. It is strange, not because people created an idol, but because of when they did it. They had just witnessed miracles. They had seen things that should have removed doubt entirely. And still, they turned around and built something out of gold and said, "This is what we trust." So, the question is not just what they did. The real question is why. Because the invisible is difficult for the human mind. You cannot see it, you cannot touch it, and you cannot point to it when uncertainty creeps in. Faith, by its nature, requires patience and trust without physical proof. That sounds simple in theory, but in reality, it creates tension. People want something they can hold, something they can look at and say, "This is real, this is here, this will not disappear when I turn around." And that is exactly what the golden calf provided. It was visible, solid, predictable. It did not require imagination or interpretation. It just existed, right in front of them. It is almost like choosing a map over the actual journey. Even if the map is inaccurate, at least it gives you something concrete, something you can rely on when the path feels uncertain. This is not just a story about ancient people making a mistake. It reveals something deeper about how the human mind works. We are drawn to what we can manage, what we can define, what we can control in a physical way. Invisible truths demand a level of trust that most people struggle to maintain for long. So the mind looks for substitutes, something simpler, something more immediate. And the uncomfortable part is that this tendency has not disappeared. It shows up in different ways now, often more subtle, often more acceptable, but the core instinct is the same. We prefer what we can see, even if it limits our understanding of what might actually be true. Dagon, the power of identity. Then there is Dagon, not just a god, but a symbol of a people, a marker of who belonged and who did not. Because in the ancient world, gods were never just beliefs floating in the air. They were tied to land, culture, and identity. To believe in a god like Dagon was not only about faith, it was about saying, "This is my group, this is where I stand." It answered a deeper question most people carry quietly. Who am I, and where do I belong? And that is where things start to feel very familiar. Because, even today, beliefs are rarely just ideas. They are part of identity. They shape how people see themselves and how they see others. Change the belief, and it does not feel like a small adjustment. It feels like losing a piece of who you are. That is why conversations about religion can turn emotional so quickly. On the surface, it looks like a disagreement about truth, but underneath, something else is happening. It feels personal. It feels like someone is questioning your place, your values, your sense of self. So people defend their beliefs, not just because they think they are right, but because those beliefs are connected to belonging, to family, to history, to community. Remove the belief, and the ground under them starts to feel unstable. And here is the key insight. Gods like Dagon were powerful not just because people believed in them, but because they unified people. They created a shared identity, a sense of us versus them. That same dynamic has not disappeared. It has simply shifted into different forms. Political views, social values, even everyday opinions can carry the same weight. Which means the real issue is not just what people believe. It is why those beliefs feel so difficult to let go of. Because when belief becomes identity, letting go does not feel like growth. It feels like loss. The real reason false gods exist. Now you can start to see the pattern more clearly. Baal gave people a sense of control over nature. Asherah offered comfort and emotional closeness. Molech answered fear in its most extreme form. The golden calf provided something visible and certain. And Dagon gave people identity and belonging. Different names, different rituals, different stories, but underneath, the functions are almost identical. Each one filled a gap. Each one responded to a pressure that people felt deeply but could not fully control. And here is the key insight that often gets missed. These gods were not just false in the sense of being incorrect, they were functional. They worked, not in a physical or objective way, but in a psychological one. They reduced anxiety, they created structure, they made life feel a little more understandable. That is why they spread so easily. Not because people were naive, but because the solutions felt real. If something reduces fear or gives you a sense of stability, you hold on to it, you pass it on. You build a system around it. And this is why simply labeling them as false does not really explain anything. It closes the conversation too quickly. It skips over the deeper layer where the real meaning sits. Because the important question is not whether these gods were true or false. The important question is why they were needed in the first place. What problem were they solving that felt so urgent, so constant, that entire societies built their lives around them? When you start asking that question, the focus shifts. It moves away from judging the past and starts revealing something about human nature itself. And that is where the conversation becomes much harder to ignore. The uncomfortable mirror. Here is where everything starts to turn. It is very easy to look back at the past and say they were wrong. It creates distance. It makes us feel more advanced, more rational, more aware. But what if that confidence is a little too comfortable? What if they were not fundamentally different from us? What if they were simply doing in the open what we have learned to do in quieter, more acceptable ways? We no longer build statues to gods like Baal or bow to objects like the golden calf. That part has changed. But the underlying behavior has not disappeared. It has evolved. Today, we build systems. We build belief structures that give us certainty. We hold on to ideas that make us feel safe, that tell us we are right, that give us a sense of control over a world that is still unpredictable. And here is the strange part. We rarely stop to question them. Not because we are incapable of thinking critically, but because these beliefs feel normal. They are reinforced by the people around us. They are built into culture, into routines, into everyday life. They do not feel like beliefs. They feel like reality. Just like Baal felt normal to those who depended on rain. Just like the golden calf felt real to those who needed something visible to trust. From the inside, it never feels like you are believing something constructed. It feels like you are simply seeing the world clearly. And that is what makes this difficult. Because once you step back, even slightly, a different question appears. Not about them, but about us. Why do we believe what we believe? What need is it serving? What fear is it calming? And that question is uncomfortable for a reason. It does not just challenge old stories. It challenges the ones we are still living inside. So, were false gods just mistakes? Or were they clues hidden in plain sight? Clues about how the human mind actually works under pressure. What we fear when things feel uncertain. What we reach for when life feels out of control. Because once you understand why humans created these gods, something shifts. You stop looking at belief as something distant, something ancient, something other people struggled with. You start seeing it as something active, something present, something closer than you expected. And that is where it becomes uncomfortable. The question is no longer why they believed in Baal or the golden calf. It becomes more personal than that. What beliefs are you holding on to right now, not because they are true, but because they make life feel more stable? Because in the end, the difference between past and present might not be belief itself. It might just be how aware we are of why we believe at all.